Gunfire cracked through the quiet morning air, and the entire street corner froze. Julian Cole ducked behind his wooden bread cart, his heart slamming against his ribs, his hands still dusted with flour. For one long breath, nobody moved. Then the black cars rolled to a stop just a few feet away from him, and 4 men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the street like hunters who had already found their prey. Julian's first thought was that he was about to die over a loaf of bread. It made no sense. He was nobody. He sold bread every morning on this same corner, the same spot he had claimed for the last 6 years, ever since he was old enough to carry the cart alone. He did not owe anyone money. He did not know any dangerous men. He baked, he sold, he went home. That was his whole life. But the gunfire had not been aimed at him. It had come from somewhere down the block, a warning shot fired into the air by one of the men now walking toward him, clearing the street of onlookers. People scattered into doorways and alleys, pulling their children close, refusing to look back. Julian wanted to run too. His legs told him to run, but his cart was still full of bread, and something about the way these men moved told him that running would be the worst thing he could do. The tallest of them held up a hand, and the others stopped instantly, falling into place behind him like soldiers waiting for an order. Julian recognized authority when he saw it, even if he had never seen this particular kind of authority before. This man did not look rushed. He did not look afraid. He looked at Julian's cart, the way a starving man might look at a locked door, hungry and furious at the same time. "Where did you learn to make that?" the man asked. His voice was calm, almost too calm, which frightened Julian more than shouting would have. Julian did not understand the question. "Learn to make what, sir?" The man stepped closer, and up close, Julian could see the details that separated him from ordinary people. His coat was tailored perfectly to his shoulders. His shoes were polished, despite the dust of the street. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had seen violence and caused violence, and had stopped being troubled by either a long time ago. And yet, standing in front of a bread cart, that same man looked almost lost. "The bread," the man said, pointing at the row of golden loaves stacked neatly on the cart. "The one with the herbs baked into the crust. The one that smells like honey underneath. Where did you learn that recipe?" Julian's mouth went dry. Of all the questions he had imagined being asked at gunpoint, this was not one of them. "It was taught to me," he said carefully, "by the woman who raised me. She passed years ago. I have made it the same way every day since, because it was the only thing of hers I had left." Something shifted in the man's face, a flicker of pain quickly hidden behind control. He picked up one of the loaves, turned it over in his hands, and pressed his thumb into the crust, releasing a small cloud of steam and the sharp scent of rosemary and something sweeter underneath. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed, just slightly, just enough for Julian to notice. "What was her name?" the man asked, and this time his voice cracked at the edges, just barely, just enough to sound human instead of dangerous. "Elena," Julian answered. "Everyone called her Mama Elena. She ran a small bakery 2 towns over, before I was born, and continued after she took me in as a boy. I never knew her by any other name." The man closed his eyes. For a moment, Julian thought he might drop the bread, might crumble it in his grip out of some emotion too large to contain. Instead, he set it down gently on the cart, as if it were something fragile and precious, something that could shatter if handled wrong. "That is not possible," the man whispered, more to himself than to Julian. "She died 8 years ago. I buried her myself. I watched them lower the coffin into the ground." Julian's stomach turned cold. "I do not know what you are talking about, sir. My Mama Elena died of illness, 4 years ago, in her own bed, with me beside her. I held her hand as she went. There was no burial you could have attended, because I was the one who arranged it." The man's eyes opened, and for the first time, Julian saw something other than danger in them. He saw grief, raw and unfinished. The kind of grief that never truly closes, but only waits, patient and quiet, for a reason to reopen. "Bring the cart," the man said suddenly, turning to his men. "Bring the boy too, gently. Nobody touches him." Julian's protest died in his throat before he could speak it. 2 of the men were already moving, one taking hold of the cart's handles, the other stepping beside Julian with a grip firm enough to guide him, but not tight enough to bruise. He looked toward the street, hoping for someone, anyone, to intervene, but the street was empty now. Doors shut, curtains drawn, the whole neighborhood pretending it saw nothing. "Please," Julian said, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound calm. "I have done nothing wrong. I only sell bread. I have customers waiting for me every morning. If I do not open my cart, they will worry." The tall man turned back to him, and for a moment, his expression softened into something almost gentle. "Nobody is going to hurt you, Julian." He said the name like he already knew it, though Julian had never given it. "I only want to understand how a woman I buried 8 years ago taught you to bake bread that only she knew how to make. If you can explain that to me, you can go home tonight with more money than you have made in your whole life selling bread on a street corner. If you cannot explain it, then we have a much larger problem, and it will not be your fault, but it will still need to be solved." Julian swallowed hard. He did not know what problem the man meant, and he was not sure he wanted to know. But something about the way the man had said Elena's name, softly, painfully, told Julian this was not a trap built from malice. It was a man chasing a ghost, and Julian, without meaning to, had become the only thread connecting him to her. They walked 3 blocks to a black car waiting at the curb, engine already running, and Julian climbed inside without further argument, flanked by 2 men who did not speak. The tall man sat across from him, watching him with an intensity that made Julian feel like a specimen under glass. Nobody spoke during the ride. Julian watched the city slide past the tinted windows, familiar streets suddenly foreign, the ordinary morning he had expected now, completely unrecognizable. They arrived at a large estate behind iron gates, guarded by more men in dark suits, all of whom nodded respectfully as the car passed. Julian had never seen anything like it. Manicured gardens stretched in every direction, fountains catching the morning light, a house so large it looked more like a small palace than a home. He thought of his own small apartment above the bakery he no longer used, the one room he called home since Elena passed, and felt suddenly, painfully small. Inside, the man led him to a study, filled with old books and dark wood furniture, and gestured for him to sit. Julian obeyed, perching on the edge of a leather chair, his hands still trembling slightly from the morning's shock. "My name is Damien Cross," the man said, finally offering something like an introduction, though it did nothing to calm Julian's nerves. Everyone in the city knew that name, whispered in fear at markets and in taxicabs, spoken of in warnings passed from parent to child. Julian had heard the name before, always attached to stories of danger, always kept at a careful distance, like a storm you watched from indoors. "You knew her," Julian said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "You knew Elena, not as a customer, as something more." Damien's expression did not change, but his silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. He walked to a cabinet along the far wall, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small wooden box. He set it on the desk between them and opened the lid, revealing a stack of old photographs, yellowed at the edges, and a folded piece of paper that looked worn from years of handling. 8 years ago, Damien said, his voice low, I was engaged to a woman named Elena Marsh. She ran from me, from this life, from everything I represented, because she believed staying would put her in danger. I searched for her for 2 years, before I found what I believed was proof of her death. A car accident, far from the city, a body burned beyond recognition, papers found nearby with her name on them. I buried an empty coffin, and grieved a woman I never got to properly say goodbye to. Julian's hands tightened in his lap. That cannot be the same woman who raised me. My Elena never mentioned any of this. She never spoke about a life before the bakery, before me. I always thought she simply never married, that she was alone before she took me in. Tell me everything you remember about her, Damien said, leaning forward, his eyes fixed on Julian, with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Every detail, every story she told you. I need to know if the woman who raised you and the woman I lost are the same person, or if this is simply the cruelest coincidence either of us will ever experience. Julian took a deep breath, memories rising unbidden, warm and painful all at once. He remembered Elena's hands, always dusted with flour, always moving with quiet purpose. He remembered the small kitchen behind their bakery, the smell of bread rising before dawn, the way she hummed old songs while she worked, songs he never recognized and never thought to ask about. He remembered her eyes, sharp and watchful, always scanning windows and doors, like she was waiting for someone to arrive, someone she both hoped for and feared. She was always careful, Julian said slowly. Careful about strangers, careful about questions, careful about our address, our names, our routine. I thought it was simply her nature. Now I wonder if she was hiding from something, or someone. Damien closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, Julian saw something close to devastation. She was hiding from me, he said quietly. Not because I would have hurt her, but because staying near me was the danger itself. My enemies would have used her against me. She must have found a way to disappear so completely that even I believed she was gone. Julian felt the ground of his understanding shift beneath him, everything he thought he knew about his own life suddenly uncertain. The woman who raised him, who taught him to bake, who held his hand through every hardship of his childhood, had been living an entirely different life before he ever knew her. A life full of danger, love, and loss that she had never once mentioned. "What do you want from me?" Julian asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Damien studied him for a long moment before answering. "I want to know everything you remember. Every letter she kept, every photograph, every small detail of her life after she left mine. I have spent 8 years believing I lost her completely. Now I have found the boy she raised in her final years, and perhaps, through you, I can finally understand what happened to her, and why she never came back to me." Julian looked down at his hands, still faintly dusted with the morning's flour, and thought of the small tin box he kept hidden beneath his bed, filled with Elena's letters and a single photograph of a young woman he had never been able to identify. He had always assumed it was simply an old picture Elena had kept for sentimental reasons. Now, sitting across from Damien Cross, he began to suspect that photograph held answers neither of them was fully prepared to face. "I have things at home," Julian said quietly. "Letters, a photograph. I never understood who was in it. Perhaps you would." Damien's expression shifted, hope and dread mixing together in a way that made him look, for just a moment, less like the feared man the whole city whispered about, and more like someone desperately searching for a piece of himself he thought had been buried forever. "Then we will go get them," Damien said, standing from his chair. "Tonight, I have waited 8 years for answers. I do not intend to wait another hour longer than necessary." Julian rose slowly, his mind spinning with questions he did not know how to ask, standing at the edge of a truth that would change everything he believed about the woman who had saved him, raised him, and loved him, without ever telling him who she truly was, or who she had truly loved before him. Before they left the study, Damien paused at the door and turned back to look at him, as though seeing him clearly for the first time. "You resemble her more than you might realize," he said quietly. "Not in your face, but in the way you carry yourself. Careful, watching every exit before you sit down. She used to do the same thing, even in rooms she trusted completely. I always thought it was simply her nature, until I understood what she had lived through before I met her. Perhaps that carefulness is something she passed on to you, without either of you ever knowing why." Julian did not know how to respond to that, so he said nothing, and followed Damien out through the long hallway toward the front of the house. The men who had brought him here fell into step a respectful distance behind, and Julian noticed how differently they moved now, less like guards escorting a stranger, and more like men accompanying someone their employer had decided to protect. It unsettled him almost as much as the gunfire had. Outside, the same black car waited at the base of the stone steps, engine idling, headlights cutting soft lines through the gathering dusk. Julian realized with a small shock that the entire morning had somehow stretched into evening, hours lost to shock and revelation, while his cart sat abandoned somewhere across the city, his usual customers left wondering where their baker had gone. "My bread," he said suddenly, the thought striking him with unexpected force. "People will worry. There is a woman who buys a loaf every morning for her husband, who is too sick to leave his bed. There is a boy who sweeps the shop next to my corner, who I always save the broken pieces for. They will think something happened to me." Damien studied him for a moment, something like respect passing briefly across his features. "Send word," he said, and one of the men immediately produced a phone, ready to carry any message Julian wished to give. It was such a small thing, this ability to simply solve a problem with a single sentence, and yet it told Julian more about the scale of Damien's power than the guns or the mansion ever could. The drive to Julian's apartment took nearly 30 minutes, weaving through streets that grew narrower and more familiar with each passing block, until finally they reached the modest building above the old bakery, its windows dark, its brick walls worn soft with age. Julian felt a strange embarrassment climbing the stairs with Damien behind him, aware suddenly of how small his life must look to a man who lived behind iron gates and manicured gardens. Inside, the apartment held the same quiet stillness it always did, Elena's presence lingering in every corner, even 4 years after her passing. Her apron still hung by the door. Her recipe cards, worn soft from years of handling, sat stacked on the kitchen shelf, exactly where she had left them. Damien stopped just inside the doorway, and Julian watched something break quietly behind his composed expression as he took in the small details of a life he had once shared with the woman he loved, reconstructed here, in miniature by a boy who had never known her true name. Julian knelt beside his bed and pulled out the tin box he had kept hidden there for years, wiping a thin layer of dust from its lid before setting it carefully on the small kitchen table. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing the letters folded in careful stacks, tied together with faded ribbon, and beneath them, the single photograph he had never understood. Damien reached for the photograph first, his fingers hesitating just above it before finally lifting it into the light. His breath caught audibly in his throat. Julian watched him stare at the image for a long, silent moment, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening in a way that Julian suspected he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "This is her," Damien said finally, his voice rough. "The day I asked her to marry me. I took this photograph myself, on the shore, before everything went wrong between us and the world we lived in." He looked up at Julian, and for the first time, something like disbelief mixed with wonder crossed his face. She kept this. All these years, hiding from everyone who might recognize her, she still kept this. Julian felt a lump rise in his throat, watching the proof settle into place before him, the final piece confirming what some part of him had already begun to suspect the moment Damien had spoken Elena's name outside his cart that morning. The woman who raised him, who taught him patience and kindness, and the quiet art of baking bread that tasted like home, had once loved this dangerous, powerful man standing in his kitchen, and had given up everything, including her own name, to keep them both alive. "There is more," Julian said quietly, sliding the stack of letters across the table. "I never opened most of them. She asked me not to, until I was older, until I understood things I do not think I understood even now. Perhaps it is time." Damien looked at the letters, then back at Julian, and something passed between them in that silence, an understanding neither of them could yet put into words. Whatever truth waited inside those folded pages would not simply answer old questions. It would reshape both of their futures, tying them together in ways neither man had expected when the morning began, with nothing more than the smell of fresh bread on a quiet street corner. The first letter shook in Damien's hands so badly that Julian almost reached out to steady it for him. He did not. Some moments needed to be endured alone, even in the presence of another person, and Julian understood, watching the man across the table, that this was one of them. Damien unfolded the paper slowly, as though it might crumble at the wrong touch, and began to read aloud in a voice that grew rougher with every line. The letter was addressed to no one, dated 8 years earlier, written in handwriting Julian recognized instantly as Elena's, the same careful loops she used on her recipe cards. "My love," Damien read, his voice catching on the words, "if you are reading this, then somehow the truth found its way to you, and I am sorry it did not come from my own mouth while I still had the chance to say it properly. I did not die in that accident. I arranged for you to believe I had, because the men hunting you would have used me to reach you, and I could not let that happen. I have taken a new name. I have found a way to disappear so completely that even you, who knows me better than anyone alive, will never think to look for me in the small towns where ordinary women bake bread and raise children who are not their own. Please do not search for me. If you love me the way I believe you do, you will let me stay gone, and you will let yourself live free of the danger my presence would bring you." Damien set the letter down and pressed his palm flat against the table, as though trying to hold himself steady through sheer physical effort. Julian watched him breathe, slow and deliberate, fighting to keep his composure in front of a boy he had met only hours earlier. "She protected me," Damien said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even after everything, even believing I had likely stopped searching for her, she still thought only of keeping me safe. That was always her way. She loved fiercely and quietly, without ever asking for anything in return." Julian did not know what to say, so he simply pushed the second letter across the table, and then the third, watching Damien's face shift through grief and disbelief, and something that looked almost like anger, directed not at Elena, but at the years stolen from both of them by circumstances neither had chosen. The letters told a story neither man had known in full. Elena had fled the city with nothing but a small bag and the clothes on her back, moving from town to town for nearly a year, before finally settling in the quiet village, where she would eventually find Julian, abandoned and alone outside a shuttered orphanage that had run out of funding and space. She had taken him in without hesitation, she wrote, because she recognized in his frightened eyes the same fear she had carried with her every day since leaving Damien behind. Raising him, she confessed in one particularly worn letter, had given her a reason to keep living in a world that had taken everything else from her. "She never told me any of this," Julian said quietly, staring down at his own hands. "I always thought she took me in, out of simple kindness. I never imagined she was running from something so large, so dangerous, that she had to erase her entire identity to survive it." Damien looked up at him, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Kindness and survival are not always separate things," he said. "Perhaps she needed you as much as you needed her. Perhaps raising you was the only way she found to keep loving something, after she believed she had lost the ability to love me safely." The two of them sat in silence for a long moment, the small apartment filled with nothing but the sound of distant traffic below and the soft rustle of paper as Damien carefully refolded each letter along its original creases. Julian watched him handle Elena's words with a tenderness that surprised him, given everything he had heard about this man before today, given the fear that gripped the city whenever his name was mentioned in passing conversation. "You are not what I expected," Julian said finally, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Damien's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Neither are you," he said. "I expected to find whoever taught you that recipe and demand answers, perhaps with more force than I used this morning. I did not expect to find a boy who loved her the way I once did, who kept her letters unopened out of respect, who carries himself with the same quiet caution she always carried. You are more like her than you realize, Julian. That much is clear to me already." The compliment settled strangely in Julian's chest, warm and unfamiliar, coming from a man he had feared only hours earlier. He thought of his own childhood, the years before Elena found him, fragments he barely remembered, faces and places that blurred together into something more like feeling than memory. He had never known his birth parents. He had never known why he had been left outside that orphanage, or what had happened to whoever left him there. Elena had never pressed him for answers he did not have, and in turn, he had never pressed her for answers about her own hidden past. Perhaps, he realized now, they had both understood something essential about each other from the very beginning, an unspoken agreement to let old wounds remain closed unless opened by choice. "There is one more letter," Julian said, reaching into the tin box and pulling out a smaller envelope, sealed shut, with a single word written across the front in Elena's careful hand. The word was a name, Damien's name. Damien stared at the envelope for a long moment before reaching for it, his hands noticeably unsteady now, all pretense of composure finally beginning to crack. He broke the seal carefully, unfolded the single page inside, and began to read, his voice barely audible. "If you have found this," the letter began, "then perhaps fate has decided we deserve one final conversation, even if only through paper and ink. I think of you every single day, Damien. I think of the life we might have had, the wedding we never finished planning, the home we never built together. I do not regret leaving, because I believe with everything in me that it kept you alive. But I regret, more than I can express, that I never found a way to tell you goodbye properly, face to face, the way you deserved. I have raised a boy who reminds me, more each year, of the kindness you always hid beneath your reputation. His name is Julian. If you ever find him, please know that loving him has been the only way I found to keep loving you, safely, from a distance you will never fully understand. Take care of him, if you can. He carries more of both of us than either of you will ever realize. Damien's hands fell to the table, the letter still clutched between his fingers, and for the first time since Julian had met him that morning, the powerful, feared man allowed himself to break completely, his shoulders shaking with a grief he had clearly been holding back for 8 long years. Julian did not move, did not speak, simply sat across the table and let the moment exist without interruption, understanding instinctively that some grief needed witness more than comfort. When Damien finally lifted his head, his eyes were red, but his expression had shifted into something firmer, something resolved. She asked me to take care of you, he said quietly. I intend to honor that, Julian, in whatever way you will allow me to. You do not have to accept anything from me tonight, but I want you to know that from this moment forward, you are not alone in this city, and you never will be again. Julian felt something shift inside his chest, a loneliness he had carried since Elena's death beginning, for the first time, to ease slightly at the edges. He had spent 4 years believing he had no one left in the world who truly understood where he came from, who had known Elena in any capacity beyond the customers who bought bread from his cart each morning. Now, sitting across from a man he had feared only hours earlier, he realized he had found someone who had loved her just as deeply, in an entirely different chapter of her life. I do not know what to ask of you, Julian admitted. I have never had anyone offer me anything beyond what I could earn with my own hands. Then ask for nothing, Damien said, and let me offer regardless. That is how I intend to honor her memory, whether you accept it easily or with hesitation. I have spent 8 years believing there was nothing left of her in this world except my own grief. Now I understand that is not true. There is you. And whatever legacy she built here, quietly, without my knowledge, deserves protection, not neglect. Outside, the evening had fully settled into night, the street below Julian's apartment growing quiet as the city's ordinary rhythms continued undisturbed by the extraordinary conversation happening in the small room above the old bakery. Julian glanced toward the window, thinking of his abandoned cart somewhere across the city, of the customers who would return tomorrow morning, expecting fresh bread and familiar routine, unaware that everything about his life had shifted overnight. What happens now? Julian asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Damien considered this for a long moment before answering. Now, I want to understand everything about the years I missed. Where she lived before you. What towns she passed through. Whether anyone else recognized her. Whether anyone from my old world ever came close to finding her before illness took her from us both. I need to understand how thoroughly she disappeared, because if she was truly as careful as these letters suggest, then perhaps there are still secrets buried in her past that neither of us fully understands yet. Julian felt a small chill move through him at those words, though he could not immediately place why. Something about the certainty in Damien's voice suggested this was not simply idle curiosity, but the beginning of an investigation that might uncover far more than either of them was prepared for. He thought of Elena's careful habits, her insistence on watching doors and windows, her refusal to ever discuss her past even when Julian, as a curious child, had asked directly. Perhaps her caution had not simply been a leftover habit from fear long past. Perhaps some part of her had always known the danger had never fully disappeared, only waited, patient and silent, for the right moment to return. As if summoned by the thought itself, a soft knock sounded at the apartment door, and Julian watched Damien's entire posture change in an instant. The grieving man from moments earlier vanishing behind the calm, alert presence Julian had first encountered on the street corner. Damien rose without a word and moved toward the door, motioning for Julian to stay seated, one hand resting near his coat, in a gesture that told Julian exactly what kind of caution this man carried with him at all times, even inside a stranger's home. It was only one of Damien's own men, breathless from climbing the stairs quickly, his expression tight with unwelcome news. He spoke in a low voice, but Julian caught fragments regardless, words like watched and followed and someone asking questions at the corner where the cart usually stood. Damien's jaw tightened, and he glanced back toward Julian with an expression that had shifted once more, this time into something protective, almost fierce. "Someone has been asking about you," Damien said, closing the door and returning to the table, though he remained standing now, tension radiating from him in a way that filled the small room. "A man at the market near your corner has been asking questions about the baker who disappeared this morning. He described himself as a concerned customer, but my man says his questions were too specific, too focused on where you live and who you speak to." Julian's stomach tightened. "Perhaps it is simply worry. I have regular customers. Someone may have noticed my cart was abandoned and grown concerned." "Perhaps," Damien allowed, though his tone made clear he did not believe it. "Or perhaps, word has already begun to spread that I took an interest in a street baker this morning, and someone within my own organization, or outside of it, wishes to understand why. I have enemies who would see any weakness, any attachment, any softness in me as an opportunity worth exploiting. If they learn about Elena, about you, about what you represent to me, I fear they will not hesitate to use that knowledge against us both." The warmth Julian had begun to feel only minutes earlier, the fragile sense of connection formed over shared grief and shared letters, curdled suddenly into something colder, more urgent. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of danger, keeping his head down, asking no questions, drawing no attention beyond the quality of his bread. Now, in the space of a single day, he had become tangled in a world of old enmities and buried secrets he barely understood, simply because his hands had learned to shape dough the way Elena once taught him. "What do we do?" Julian asked, his voice steadier than he expected, though his pulse continued to race beneath his calm exterior. Damien studied him for a long moment, something calculating entering his expression, the look of a man already several steps ahead in a game Julian could not yet fully see. "Tonight, you stay here, under guard, in case whoever is asking questions decides to act quickly. Tomorrow, we move you somewhere safer, at least until I understand who is watching and why. I will not let history repeat itself, Julian. I lost her once to secrecy and distance. I will not lose the only piece of her I have left to carelessness." Julian wanted to argue, wanted to insist he could take care of himself, that he had survived this long without protection and could continue doing so. But some quiet, honest part of him recognized the truth in Damien's words, recognized that the danger surrounding this powerful man had never fully disappeared, only waited in the shadows for a reason to resurface, and that reason now had a face, a name, and a small apartment above an old bakery that suddenly felt far less safe than it had that morning. "I trusted her instincts my whole life," Julian said quietly. "I suppose I can trust yours tonight, even if I do not yet understand this world you are asking me to step into." Something in Damien's expression eased slightly at those words, gratitude mixed with renewed determination. "Then rest if you can," he said. "Tomorrow, we begin uncovering exactly how much of her past has followed us both into the present, and exactly who still remembers the name she tried so carefully to leave behind." Damien left two of his men stationed outside the apartment door, quiet, watchful figures, who nodded once at Julian, before settling into position for the long night ahead. Julian lay awake on his narrow bed long after the apartment fell silent, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the city below, unable to quiet the storm of thoughts spinning through his mind. He thought of Elena kneading dough in the early hours before dawn, her sleeves pushed up, flour dusting her forearms, humming those unfamiliar songs he now understood must have come from a life she left behind in the city, a life filled with danger and love in equal measure. He thought of the careful way she taught him each step of every recipe, insisting on precision, insisting on patience, values he had always assumed came simply from her nature as a baker, never once suspecting they might have been lessons learned from surviving a world where a single careless mistake could cost everything. He thought, too, of the man now sleeping somewhere within his own guarded estate across the city, a man the whole world feared, who had wept openly at a kitchen table over letters written by a woman neither of them could ever hold again. Julian had spent years imagining men like Damien as distant and cold, existing only in whispered warnings and cautionary tales told by frightened neighbors. He had not expected to find grief so raw, so genuine, hidden beneath that reputation. Somewhere near midnight, exhaustion finally overtook him, and Julian drifted into uneasy sleep, dreams tangled with images of bread rising in warm kitchens, and quiet figures watching from street corners, unable to fully separate memory from imagination, past from present, safety from the uncertainty now settling quietly around the edges of his ordinary life. He woke before dawn out of old habit, the same time he had risen every morning for 6 years to prepare his cart, and for a moment, lying in the gray pre-dawn light, he almost believed the previous day had been nothing more than a vivid, unsettling dream. Then he heard low voices outside his door, the quiet murmur of the men still standing guard, and reality settled back over him with quiet, inescapable weight. He rose and dressed slowly, his mind already turning toward the questions still waiting to be answered. The towns Elena might have passed through before finding him, the people who might still remember her, the uncertainty that had somehow followed her, even into a small apartment above a bakery that had, until yesterday, felt like the safest place in the world. Whatever came next, Julian understood now that there was no returning to the simple, quiet life he had known before Damien Cross stopped in front of his cart and recognized the taste of a recipe he thought he had lost forever. A black sedan trailed them for nearly 10 minutes before Damien's driver finally lost it through a series of sharp turns down narrow side streets, and Julian gripped the door handle so tightly his knuckles turned pale, his breath coming fast and shallow as the car finally straightened out onto a quieter road. "Someone is definitely watching us," Damien said grimly, glancing back through the rear window one final time before turning his attention forward again. "That confirms what my man suspected last night. Whoever is asking questions about you has already connected you to me, and they are not being subtle about their interest." Julian tried to steady his breathing, his mind still racing from the sudden burst of speed and sharp turns that had thrown him against the door twice in quick succession. Who would even know to look for me? Yesterday I was nobody, a baker on a street corner. Now suddenly I am being followed by strangers in cars. "Word travels fast in my world," Damien said, his jaw tight. "My enemies have people watching my movements at all times, waiting for any opportunity, any sign of weakness they can exploit. When I abandoned my usual schedule yesterday to visit a bread cart, personally, with my full escort, that alone would have been noticed. Add to that the fact that I brought you to my estate, then to your apartment, and stationed guards outside your door overnight, and it becomes very easy for anyone paying attention to conclude that you matter to me. That alone makes you a target, whether you understand why or not." The weight of that realization settled heavily over Julian, and he found himself thinking, not for the first time since yesterday morning, that his simple life of flour and dough and quiet routine felt impossibly distant now, replaced by something far more dangerous and complicated than he had ever imagined for himself. They arrived at a modest, unmarked building on the edge of the city, far from the grandeur of Damien's estate, and Julian followed him inside to find a small office staffed by a single older woman, surrounded by filing cabinets and stacks of paper that seemed to stretch back decades. Damien introduced her simply as Margaret, a woman he trusted completely, who had spent years helping him track down information that others could not, or would not, find. "I need everything you can locate on a woman who may have used the name Elena Marsh, or possibly other aliases, over the past 12 years, Damien said, sliding a folded piece of paper across the desk toward her, containing details Julian had provided the night before, about towns Elena had mentioned in passing, dates that roughly matched fragments of her story. She would have appeared suddenly, in a small town roughly 8 years ago, likely with no prior records, no family connections, nothing that would explain her sudden presence. Margaret studied the paper carefully, then looked up at Julian with an assessing gaze that made him feel, for a brief moment, as though she could see straight through him to whatever truth still waited buried in old records. "This will take time," she said, "but if she truly disappeared as thoroughly as you believe, there will still be traces. Nobody vanishes completely, no matter how careful they are. There is always a paper trail somewhere, even if it takes years to uncover." While Margaret began her search, Damien led Julian to a small back room where a single table held stacks of old newspapers and photographs, materials Damien had apparently gathered over the years in his own private search for answers about Elena's disappearance. Julian sat across from him, watching as Damien sorted through the materials with practiced efficiency, occasionally pausing to explain a detail or point out a connection Julian would not have understood on his own. "This is the accident report," Damien said, sliding a faded photocopy across the table. "The one that convinced me she had died. A car found, burned on a remote road, 2 hours from the city, papers with her name found nearby, badly damaged but legible enough to identify. At the time, grief made me accept the evidence without question. Looking at it now, with everything we know, I wonder how much of this was staged, and by whom." Julian studied the report carefully, noting details he barely understood, technical language about the state of the vehicle, the condition of the remains, conclusions drawn by investigators who had apparently closed the case within days. "If she staged her own death, she would have needed help," Julian said slowly, thinking through the logic as he spoke. "Money for false documents, knowledge of investigation procedures, someone willing to plant evidence convincing enough to fool people who clearly wanted to disprove it. That is not something one woman could accomplish entirely alone, especially not while fleeing for her life." Damien's expression sharpened at that observation, something calculating entering his eyes. "You are right," he said slowly. "Someone helped her disappear. Someone with resources. Someone who understood exactly how to fool investigators, working under my direction. That narrows the possibilities considerably. There were only a handful of people close enough to me at that time who would have had both the knowledge and the motivation to help her vanish so completely." "Would they have done it out of loyalty to her?" Julian asked. "Or against you, somehow?" Damien considered this carefully before answering. "Both are possible. I had allies then who genuinely cared for Elena, who might have helped her escape purely to save her life, understanding the danger she faced better than I did myself. But I also had people close to me who resented my position, who might have seen her disappearance as a way to weaken me, to distract me with grief while they pursued their own ambitions. 8 years is a long time. Some of those people are gone now, retired or otherwise removed from positions of influence. Others remain, closer to me than I would like to admit, and this new information forces me to consider possibilities I had never previously entertained." The implications of that statement hung heavily in the small room, and Julian found himself studying Damien's face carefully, searching for any sign of the calculation he imagined must now be happening behind those careful eyes, reassessing years of trusted relationships in light of this sudden, unsettling revelation. Margaret returned nearly 2 hours later, a thin folder clutched in her hands, her expression carefully neutral in a way that told Julian she had found something significant. She set the folder down on the table between them and opened it slowly, revealing a handful of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a copy of an old identification card bearing a name Julian did not recognize, alongside a photograph that was unmistakably Elena, younger, her hair styled differently, but her eyes exactly as Julian remembered them. "The trail is faint," Margaret said, "but it exists. She appears to have lived under this name for roughly 18 months before settling in the village where she eventually raised your boy. There is a gap of nearly 6 months before that, during which I found nothing at all, which suggests she may have been moving frequently, staying nowhere long enough to leave records behind." Damien studied the identification card carefully, his expression tightening as he read the details. "This name," he said slowly, "belongs to a documentation specialist who worked for me during that period. A man who had access to exactly the kind of resources needed to create a convincing false identity and stage a believable death. I trusted him completely at the time. He left my organization not long after Elena's supposed death, citing personal reasons, and I never questioned it further, because I was too consumed by grief to think clearly about anything beyond my own loss." "Do you know where he is now?" Julian asked, leaning forward despite himself, caught up in the unfolding mystery, despite the danger it clearly represented. "I do not," Damien admitted, "but I intend to find out. If he helped her disappear, he may know things neither of us currently understands. He may even know whether the danger that forced her into hiding still exists today, or whether it has simply been waiting, dormant, for a reason to resurface." His eyes moved to Julian, something protective and determined settling into his expression. Given what happened last night, given the car that followed us this morning, I suspect we are about to find out exactly how dormant that old danger truly is. Margaret cleared her throat gently, drawing their attention back to her. There is one more thing, she said carefully. According to these records, the specialist you are asking about did not simply leave your organization voluntarily. There is a notation here, buried in old correspondence, suggesting he was forced out after someone discovered irregularities in his work. I cannot determine who discovered this, or why it was never brought to your attention directly, but the timing aligns almost exactly with the period following Elena's disappearance. Damien's expression darkened considerably at this new information, and Julian watched him process the implications, with visible tension building across his shoulders. Someone within my own organization knew, Damien said quietly, more to himself than to either of them. Someone knew he had helped her, and instead of informing me, they chose to quietly remove him and bury the evidence. That means someone I trusted, someone still likely close to my current operations, has been keeping this secret from me for 8 years, allowing me to grieve a woman who was, in fact, still alive. The weight of betrayal settled visibly over Damien's features, and Julian found himself, despite everything, feeling a pang of genuine sympathy for this powerful, dangerous man who had spent nearly a decade mourning a loss that had, in some sense, never truly happened, kept from the truth by people he had trusted with his own life. We need to find this specialist before whoever silenced him 8 years ago decides to silence him again, Damien said, rising from his chair with sudden urgency. And we need to do it quickly, because if people are already watching you, Julian, it means someone understands exactly how close we are getting to answers they clearly do not want uncovered. Margaret worked quickly once, given her new directive, pulling old employment records, tax documents, and utility bills that might reveal where the documentation specialist had relocated after leaving Damien's organization. Julian watched her work with quiet admiration, struck by how much of this hidden world operated not through violence, but through patience, paperwork, and careful attention to detail that most people would never notice. Within the hour, Margaret had a name and an address. The specialist, now going by Callum Ward, had settled in a coastal town nearly 3 hours from the city, working as an ordinary print shop owner, seemingly having built an entirely new, quiet life, far removed from his previous work. Damien studied the address for a long moment before folding the paper and slipping it into his coat pocket. We leave within the hour, he said, already moving toward the door. I want to reach him before anyone else realizes we have found his trail. The drive to the coastal town stretched long and mostly silent, Julian watching the city give way to open fields, and then, eventually, the distant glimmer of water on the horizon. He found himself thinking about Elena again, wondering how many times she might have driven similar roads herself, fleeing from one temporary safety to another, always watching the mirrors, always calculating how much time remained before she needed to move again. Did she ever seem afraid? Damien asked suddenly, breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. In all your years with her, did you ever see fear in her, even for a moment? Julian considered the question carefully before answering. Not fear exactly, more like readiness. She always knew where the doors were. She always sat facing entrances in restaurants, though I never once ate in a restaurant with her more than a handful of times in my whole childhood. She kept very little, moved us twice that I can remember, though I never understood why at the time. I thought it was simply her nature to be cautious. Now I understand she was protecting both of us, every single day, without ever letting the weight of it show on her face. Damien's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. That sounds exactly like her, he said quietly. She always carried her burdens silently, never wanting others to worry on her behalf. It is, perhaps, the quality I loved most about her, and the quality that ultimately drove her away from me, believing she could protect me better through silence and distance than through honesty. They reached the coastal town as afternoon began sliding toward evening, the print shop easy enough to locate along the town's modest main street, its windows displaying faded advertisements for business cards and wedding invitations. Damien parked across the street and studied the building for a long moment before speaking. Let me approach him first, he said. If he recognizes me immediately, he may panic, and I need him calm enough to talk. You wait here, out of sight, until I signal that it is safe. Julian nodded, though every instinct told him to insist on accompanying Damien inside. He watched from the car as Damien crossed the street and entered the shop, the small bell above the door audible even from this distance. Minutes passed slowly, tension building in Julian's chest with each one, until finally he saw Damien appear in the doorway, gesturing for him to come inside. Callum Ward turned out to be an older man, gray at the temples, with the tired, careful eyes of someone who had spent years looking over his shoulder. When Julian entered the shop, Callum's gaze moved to him immediately, and something shifted in his expression, recognition mixing visibly with dread. "You have her eyes," Callum said quietly, before either of them could speak. "Elena's boy. I always wondered if I would ever meet you." "You knew about me," Julian said, more statement than question. Callum nodded slowly, moving to lock the shop door behind them and lower the blinds over the front windows, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to protecting himself from unwanted attention. "I helped her disappear," he admitted, turning back to face them both. "Documents, a new identity, a staged accident convincing enough to satisfy even the most thorough investigation. She paid me everything she had, and I would have done it for free, honestly, because I believed she deserved a chance at a real life, away from danger that had nothing to do with her own choices." "Why did you leave my organization?" Damien asked, his voice carefully controlled, despite the obvious tension building beneath the surface. "Margaret found records suggesting you were forced out after someone discovered what you had done. Who discovered it, Callum? Who has known this truth for 8 years, while I believed she was dead?" Callum's expression grew troubled, his eyes darting briefly toward the shop's rear entrance, as though even now, years removed from that world, old habits of caution remained impossible to fully shake. "It was someone close to you," he said finally, his voice dropping lower. "Someone who discovered the falsified reports and threatened to expose both Elena and myself unless I disappeared quietly and never spoke of what I had done. I was frightened enough to comply immediately. I built this quiet life here, specifically because I hoped I would never have to think about any of it again." "Who?" Damien pressed, stepping closer, his composure beginning to fray at the edges. "I need a name, Callum. Someone has been keeping this secret from me for 8 years, allowing me to grieve a woman who was still alive, and now that same person may be responsible for whoever has been following Julian since yesterday." Callum hesitated, clearly weighing the danger of speaking against the danger of remaining silent, before finally exhaling heavily and meeting Damien's eyes directly. "Vincent Cole," he said quietly, "your own cousin. He came to me not long after Elena disappeared, already suspicious, already investigating on his own before I understood what he had found. He never told me why he wanted her gone so badly, only that keeping quiet would be far safer for me than speaking the truth." The name settled over the small shop like a physical weight, and Julian watched Damien's face drain of color, disbelief, and fury warring visibly across his features. "Vincent," Damien repeated, almost to himself, the name carrying clear history and betrayal in equal measure. "He has been at my side for 8 years, offering condolences, helping me search for answers he already possessed. He let me believe she was dead, while quietly ensuring she stayed that way. And now, if he has learned that Julian exists, that the truth may finally surface after all this time, there is no telling what he might be willing to do to keep it buried permanently." Julian felt a cold weight settle in his stomach at those final words, the abstract danger he had sensed since yesterday morning suddenly gaining a face, a name, a motive rooted in something far more personal than he had imagined. He glanced at Damien, watching betrayal harden into something colder and more resolved, and understood, without needing to be told, that whatever came next would test both of them far more severely than anything they had faced so far. "We need to leave," Damien said finally, turning to Callum with a grave expression. "Both of us. If Vincent learns we have spoken with you, your safety will be at risk as well. Pack what you need tonight. I will arrange somewhere secure for you to stay, until this is resolved." Callum nodded slowly, and Julian watched the older man's hands tremble slightly as he began gathering papers from his desk, the quiet life he had built for himself already unraveling around him. The bullet shattered the front window of the print shop before anyone inside had time to react, and Julian hit the floor instinctively, his ears ringing, glass raining down around him in glittering fragments. Callum shouted something unintelligible, scrambling behind his counter, while Damien moved with terrifying speed, pulling Julian further away from the broken window and pressing him flat against the wall beside a filing cabinet. "Stay down," Damien ordered, his voice sharp and controlled despite the chaos, already reaching for the phone in his coat pocket. "Someone followed us here. We need to move now." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs as he pressed himself against the wall, glass crunching beneath his shoes, adrenaline flooding through him so intensely his hands shook uncontrollably. He had spent his entire life avoiding exactly this kind of danger, and now, in the space of 2 days, he had been thrust directly into its center, crouched on a shop floor, while unknown enemies fired at a building he stood inside. Damien spoke rapidly into his phone, issuing directions Julian barely understood, before ending the call and turning back to assess the situation. "My men are 8 minutes out," he said. "We need to get to the back entrance and find better cover until they arrive." "Callum, is there a way out from behind your counter?" Callum, still crouched low, nodded shakily, and gestured toward a narrow hallway, leading to what appeared to be a storage room, and, beyond it, a rear exit. The three of them moved carefully, staying low, Damien leading with his attention split between the front of the shop and the path ahead, until they reached the storage room and the relative safety of its solid brick walls. "Who is out there?" Julian asked, his voice unsteady despite his effort to sound calm. "Is it Vincent? Did he already find us?" "I do not know," Damien admitted, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "But the timing is too precise to be coincidence. Either Vincent has been tracking my movements more closely than I realized, or someone within my own ranks alerted him the moment we began investigating Callum's whereabouts. Either possibility is deeply troubling." They waited in tense silence, the distant sound of a second gunshot echoing somewhere outside, followed by the screech of tires and shouting voices Julian could not fully make out. Minutes stretched unbearably long, each second amplified by fear and uncertainty, until finally, the sound of multiple vehicles arriving outside signaled the arrival of Damien's men. By the time they emerged cautiously from the storage room, the street outside had fallen quiet again, Damien's guards fanning out to secure the area, while others checked the surrounding buildings for any sign of the shooter. Julian stood in the wreckage of the shattered front window, staring at the shop's ruined interior, understanding with sudden, painful clarity that this danger was not abstract, not distant, but immediate and capable of ending his life without warning. "We found nothing," one of Damien's men reported, jogging back to where they stood. "Whoever fired was already gone by the time we arrived. Professional work, clearly planned in advance. This was not a random act." Damien's expression darkened further at this confirmation, his suspicion about Vincent's involvement hardening into something closer to certainty. "Get Callum somewhere secure immediately," he instructed. "And I want increased security on Julian starting tonight, no exceptions, no gaps in coverage. If Vincent is willing to attack us openly, in broad daylight, then he has already decided that whatever we might uncover poses enough danger to justify open conflict." Callum, still visibly shaken, allowed himself to be led toward one of the waiting vehicles, throwing one final, grateful glance toward Julian before disappearing into the car that would carry him toward whatever safe location Damien's organization could arrange on short notice. Julian watched him go, feeling a strange, unexpected kinship with the older man, both of them swept up in dangers neither had chosen, both of them protected now by a man whose reputation for danger, Julian was rapidly learning, existed alongside an equally fierce capacity for loyalty. The drive back to the city passed in heavy silence, Julian staring out the window at the darkening countryside, his mind replaying the shattering glass, the sharp crack of gunfire, the terror of pressing himself against a wall while bullets found their way into a building he occupied. He thought of Elena again, wondering how many similar moments she must have endured during her own years of hiding, how much fear she must have carried silently, while still finding the strength to raise him with warmth and patience, despite everything threatening her from the shadows. "I am sorry," Damien said quietly, breaking the silence as the city skyline finally came into view ahead of them. I never intended to pull you into danger this severe. I only wanted answers about a recipe that reminded me of a woman I loved. I did not expect that search to place your life at risk within 2 days. You did not create this danger, Julian said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice. Elena's choices, Vincent's betrayal, whatever happened 8 years ago, none of that began with you seeking me out yesterday morning. If anything, I think finding me may have simply forced secrets that were always going to surface eventually, whether through you or through some other circumstance neither of us could have predicted. Damien glanced at him with something like surprise, followed quickly by quiet respect. You have her wisdom, he said softly. She always had a way of seeing clearly through chaos, of finding calm reasoning, even in moments of genuine danger. I forgot how rare that quality truly is, until I saw it reflected in you today. They arrived at Damien's estate, as full darkness settled over the city, the gates closing securely behind them, guards doubling their usual patrols along the perimeter walls. Julian followed Damien inside, exhaustion and lingering adrenaline making his legs feel unsteady beneath him, grateful when Damien led him not back to the formal study, but to a smaller, quieter sitting room where a fire already burned low in the hearth. You should rest here tonight, Damien said, gesturing to the comfortable room around them. I have already arranged a guest suite upstairs. Given what happened today, I do not think returning to your apartment would be wise, not until we understand exactly how far Vincent is willing to go, and exactly how much of my own organization he may have already compromised. Julian nodded, too tired to argue, sinking into a nearby chair as Damien moved to pour them both something warm to drink. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the crackling fire filling the silence between them, both men processing the violence of the day in their own private ways. Tell me about Vincent, Julian said finally, needing to understand the man who now represented such immediate danger to both their lives. What was he like, before all of this? Did you trust him completely? Damien considered the question carefully before answering, his expression growing distant as he searched through years of memory. Vincent joined my organization not long after I inherited leadership from my father. He was ambitious, intelligent, always eager to prove his loyalty through action rather than words. I trusted him because he never once gave me reason to doubt him, not in 8 years of working closely together. Looking back now, I wonder how much of that loyalty was genuine, and how much was simply patience, waiting for the right moment to position himself closer to power. Do you think he wanted Elena gone because he saw her as a threat to his own ambitions? Julian asked, piecing together fragments of motive from everything they had learned so far. It is possible, Damien said slowly. Elena and I planned to marry. Had that happened, any children we had together would have represented a direct line of succession that Vincent, as merely a cousin, could never claim for himself. If he believed Elena's presence threatened his own future position within the organization, he may have seen her disappearance, and later her presumed death, as something worth protecting through silence, even if it meant allowing me to grieve unnecessarily for 8 long years. The calculation behind such a betrayal settled heavily over the room, and Julian found himself struggling to reconcile the image of a loyal cousin, trusted for nearly a decade, with someone capable of such calculated cruelty. He thought of his own life, simple and quiet until 2 days ago, and marveled at how thoroughly it had become entangled with ambitions and betrayals, stretching back long before he was even born. What happens now? Julian asked, echoing the same question he had asked the night before, though the stakes felt immeasurably higher after today's violence. Damien's expression hardened with quiet resolve as he stared into the fire. Now, I confront Vincent directly, but carefully, with enough evidence and enough protection in place that he cannot simply eliminate the threat we represent through further violence. I have spent 8 years unknowingly allowing his betrayal to go unpunished. I do not intend to allow it to continue a single day longer than necessary, especially not now that your life has become entangled in the consequences of choices he made long before you ever existed. Julian sat quietly for a while, watching the fire, letting the warmth of the room slowly ease the tension still coiled tight in his shoulders. Will you tell me how you plan to confront him? He asked eventually. Or is that something I should not know? Damien glanced at him, weighing the question carefully before answering. You deserve to know, given everything you have already risked, simply by existing as her son. Vincent will not expect confrontation so soon after today's attack. He will assume we are still reeling from the shock, still trying to secure Callum and assess the damage. That assumption gives us a narrow window to gather more concrete evidence before he has time to cover his tracks further, or arrange additional attempts against either of us. What kind of evidence would be enough? Julian asked. Callum's word alone. Would that be sufficient to prove what Vincent did? Not entirely, Damien admitted. Vincent is intelligent enough to deny everything, to claim Callum is lying out of some grudge or confusion. I need something more concrete. Financial records showing payments made to silence Callum 8 years ago. Communications between Vincent and anyone else who might have helped him bury the truth. If such records exist, Margaret may be able to locate them, given enough time and the right starting point. Julian nodded slowly, absorbing the careful strategy behind Damien's calm exterior, understanding now that the man's reputation for danger extended beyond mere violence into something more precise and calculated. You think like her, Julian said suddenly, the observation surprising him even as he spoke it. Elena, I mean. She always thought several steps ahead too, always planning quietly before acting. I used to think it was simply caution. Now I wonder if it was something she learned from watching people like you navigate danger her whole adult life. Something flickered across Damien's face at those words, a complicated mixture of grief and tenderness that he quickly composed back into careful neutrality. Perhaps we influenced each other more than either of us realized, he said quietly. I have spent 8 years believing I lost everything of her except memory. Sitting here with you tonight, I am beginning to understand that some part of her survived in ways I never expected, passed forward through the years she spent raising you. The fire crackled softly between them, and for a moment, the danger of the day receded just slightly, replaced by something quieter and more human. Two men bound together by loss and unexpected connection, searching for solid ground amid circumstances neither had chosen. Julian found himself, despite the fear still humming beneath his skin, grateful for this strange companionship that had emerged from tragedy, grateful that Elena's memory had led him, however dangerously, towards someone who understood exactly how deeply he had loved her. A soft knock interrupted the moment, and one of Damien's men entered, offering a brief update on security measures now in place around the estate, and confirming that Callum had been safely relocated to a secure location outside the city. Damien thanked him and dismissed him with quiet efficiency, before turning his attention back to Julian, his expression shifting once more into something more focused and determined. Tomorrow, I want you to remain here at the estate, under full protection, Damien said. I will meet with Margaret personally to review whatever additional evidence she has managed to gather overnight. Once we have enough to confront Vincent directly, I intend to do so in a controlled setting, surrounded by people whose loyalty I trust completely, minimizing any opportunity for him to escalate the situation further. And if he does escalate anyway? Julian asked, unable to fully shake the memory of shattering glass and gunfire from earlier that day. Damien's expression grew grave. Then I will handle it, he said simply, though the weight behind those words suggested a resolve Julian did not fully want to examine too closely. I have protected this organization for many years, Julian. I know how to handle threats from within it, even ones as personal and painful as this one has become. What matters most right now is ensuring your safety, and finally securing the truth Elena sacrificed so much to protect. Julian nodded, though sleep felt impossibly distant despite his exhaustion, his mind still cycling through the events of the past 2 days, the sudden violent unraveling of the quiet life he had built for himself since Elena's passing. He thought of his abandoned cart, of the customers who would find no bread waiting for them again this morning, of the ordinary rhythms of his life that felt, now, like they belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had existed before gunfire and betrayal and stolen letters had reshaped everything he understood about his own history. Can I ask you something? Julian said quietly, watching the flames dance in the hearth. If she had never left you, if none of this had ever happened, do you think you would have been happy together? Truly happy, I mean, beyond the danger and secrecy? Damien considered the question for a long moment, his expression softening into something distant and wistful. I believe we would have been, he said finally, She had a way of making even difficult days feel manageable, of finding warmth in small moments most people overlook entirely. I think, had circumstances allowed it, we would have built a quiet life together, perhaps even a family of our own. Instead, she built that life with you, under a different name, carrying grief and love for both of us, silently, every single day. I find myself grateful for that, even amid everything else I feel tonight. She was not alone, she had you, and in some strange way, I have you now too. The sincerity in Damien's voice settled something uncertain within Julian's chest, a small measure of peace amid the chaos and danger surrounding them both. He thought of Elena's final letter, her words asking Damien to care for him, and understood now, more fully than he had that first night, that her request had not been simple sentiment, but a genuine hope that the two people she loved most might find something meaningful in each other, even after she was gone. "Thank you," Julian said quietly, "for taking her request seriously, for treating me like more than simply a stranger who happened to inherit her recipe." "You are far more than that," Damien said firmly. "You are the living continuation of everything she built after leaving my world behind. Protecting you is not an obligation, Julian. It has become something I genuinely want to do, for her memory, and increasingly, for your own sake as well." Outside, the estate settled into quiet stillness as the night deepened further, guards maintaining careful watch along every perimeter, while inside, two men who had begun as strangers only 2 days earlier found themselves bound together by grief, danger, and the fragile beginnings of something that resembled family. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, evidence, and likely further danger as Vincent's betrayal moved toward its inevitable reckoning. Tonight, at least, they had found a small measure of peace within the fragile permanence of the truth they now shared. Julian eventually made his way upstairs to the guest suite Damien had arranged, a room far grander than anything he had ever slept in, yet he found himself missing the familiar creak of his own small apartment, the faint scent of flour that always lingered in its walls. He lay awake for a long while, listening to the quiet movements of guards patrolling below his window, before finally allowing exhaustion to pull him into a restless, dreamless sleep, uncertain of what tomorrow's confrontation with Vincent might ultimately bring for either of them. Downstairs, long after Julian had gone to rest, Damien remained by the fire, staring into the flames with Elena's final letter still folded carefully in his hand, silently promising the memory of the woman he had loved, that whatever it cost him, Vincent's betrayal would finally be answered, and her son would remain safe under his protection for as long as it took to make things right. The study door burst open before dawn, and Julian jolted upright in bed as shouting erupted somewhere below, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of a struggle, furniture crashing, voices raised in anger and alarm. He threw on his clothes quickly, heart pounding, and rushed toward the stairs, nearly colliding with one of Damien's guards racing in the opposite direction. "Stay upstairs," the guard ordered sharply, but Julian ignored him, pushing past toward the source of the commotion, terror, for Damien's safety, overriding every instinct toward self-preservation. He arrived at the study to find chaos frozen mid-motion, Damien standing near his desk, blood trickling from a shallow cut along his temple, while two of his men restrained a third man Julian did not immediately recognize, pinning him against the wall despite his continued struggle. It took only a moment for Julian to understand, from the fury radiating off Damien's expression, exactly who they had captured. "Vincent," Julian said quietly, and the restrained man's eyes snapped toward him, something calculating and cold flickering behind his initial panic. "So this is him," Vincent said, his voice carrying forced calm despite his compromised position. "The baker. I should have finished this before you ever found him, Damien. Should have handled it the moment I heard you stopped at that street corner." "You mean before I discovered 8 years of your betrayal," Damien said, his voice deadly quiet, the kind of calm that Julian had already learned to recognize as far more dangerous than shouting. "Margaret found everything, Vincent. The payments to Callum, the threats you made against him, the falsified reports you buried, to keep me believing Elena was dead. Did you truly think I would never uncover the truth?" Vincent's expression shifted, calculation giving way slowly to resignation, as he recognized the full weight of evidence now arrayed against him. "I did what was necessary," he said, his voice hardening with old resentment finally surfacing after years of careful concealment. You were going to marry her, Damien. Build a family that would push me permanently to the margins of everything I had worked for since childhood. I could not allow that. When I discovered she was planning to disappear on her own, running from threats even you did not fully understand, I simply ensured her disappearance became permanent in your mind. I never harmed her directly. I only made certain you never found your way back to each other.
You stole 8 years from me, Damien said, his voice trembling now with barely restrained fury.
8 years of grief, for a woman who was alive, raising a son, building a life I never knew existed. You let me mourn her every single day, while you stood beside me, offering false comfort, knowing the entire time that the truth could have ended my suffering instantly. Your suffering secured my position, Vincent said coldly, any pretense of remorse vanishing entirely from his expression. A grieving leader, focused inward, distracted by loss, was far easier to work alongside than one distracted by a new marriage and potential heirs, who would have permanently ended my own ambitions within this organization. I regret nothing, Damien. I would make the same choice again, if given the opportunity. The coldness of that confession settled heavily over the room, and Julian watched Damien's expression harden into something Julian had not yet witnessed in their short time together. A controlled fury that seemed to draw on years of buried grief, finally finding a clear target. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension in the room stretched taut enough that Julian found himself holding his breath, uncertain what violence might follow such a stark admission of betrayal. Take him to the security room, Damien said finally, his voice regaining careful control despite the visible effort it required. I want him held securely while I decide exactly how to handle this situation. He will not be harmed further, but he will not be permitted to leave or communicate with anyone outside this estate until I determine the appropriate consequences for 8 years of calculated betrayal. The guards moved to escort Vincent from the room, his expression twisting with something between fear and continued defiance as he was led away, still muttering justifications that grew fainter as they disappeared down the hallway. Julian remained frozen near the doorway, processing the confrontation he had just witnessed, the raw confession of betrayal that had finally answered questions haunting both him and Damien since this entire ordeal began. Are you hurt? Julian asked finally, moving closer to examine the cut along Damien's temple, still seeping a thin line of blood down toward his jaw. It is nothing, Damien said, though he allowed Julian to guide him toward a chair, some of the fierce tension finally beginning to drain from his shoulders now that the confrontation had ended without further violence. He came here before dawn, hoping to eliminate the evidence Margaret gathered before I had a chance to act on it. My men intercepted him before he reached the study, though he managed to strike me once before they subdued him fully. Julian found a cloth and pressed it gently against the wound, an instinct born from years of tending small kitchen accidents alongside Elena, who had taught him basic care for burns and cuts long before he ever imagined applying those lessons to a man like Damien Cross. You could have been killed, Julian said quietly, the reality of how close the confrontation had come to tragedy finally settling over him. Perhaps, Damien acknowledged, but I was not. And now, finally, the truth stands fully confirmed. 8 years of grief. 8 years of believing I had lost her completely, all built on a betrayal committed by someone I trusted with my own life. I do not yet know how I will move forward from this, Julian, but I know that finding you, learning the truth about Elena's survival and her final years, has given me something I thought impossible only 3 days ago. Closure, however painful, and an unexpected connection to the family I believed I would never have. Julian sat quietly beside him, the cloth still pressed gently against Damien's wound, both of them processing the enormity of everything that had unfolded since that ordinary morning when Julian had simply been selling bread on a familiar street corner. He thought of Elena, of her careful sacrifices, her hidden grief, her determination to protect both the man she loved and the boy she had chosen to raise as her own, even at tremendous personal cost. What will happen to Vincent now? Julian asked, curiosity mixing with genuine concern about what justice might look like within this dangerous world he had only recently begun to understand. He will face consequences appropriate to his betrayal, Damien said carefully. handled according to the codes governing my organization, though I do not intend to discuss those details with you directly. What matters most now is that the danger surrounding you has been contained. Vincent acted largely alone in this deception, motivated by personal ambition rather than any larger conspiracy. With him removed from any position of influence, the threat against your safety diminishes significantly. Relief washed through Julian at those words. The constant tension he had carried since gunfire first interrupted his ordinary morning finally beginning to ease. He thought of his cart, still likely sitting wherever it had been left, his customers who must be wondering by now what had happened to their baker, the simple routine that had defined his life for 6 years, suddenly feeling both distant and precious in equal measure. "I should return to my bread cart soon," Julian said, a small, tired smile finding its way onto his face despite everything they had endured together. "People will be worried, and I imagine flour does not wait patiently for anyone, even during family emergencies." Damien laughed softly, the sound carrying genuine warmth despite the exhaustion evident in his expression. "You truly are her son," he said, shaking his head slightly. "Even after everything that happened this morning, your first concern is for the people depending on your bread each day. She would be proud of the man you have become, Julian. I am certain of that." Later that same day, once the estate had settled back into a fragile calm, Damien invited Julian to walk with him through the gardens behind the main house, the two of them moving slowly along stone paths, lined with flowers Julian could not name, the morning's violence still lingering at the edges of both their thoughts, despite the peaceful surroundings. "I owe you an apology," Damien said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I pulled you into danger you never asked for, simply because I could not let go of a scent, a taste, a memory triggered by a loaf of bread on a street corner. Whatever happens between us going forward, I want you to know that I understand the cost this has already placed on you." Julian considered this carefully before responding, watching sunlight filter through the leaves overhead. "I do not regret it," he said finally, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "Frightening as these past few days have been, I finally understand who Elena truly was, beyond simply the woman who raised me. I understand the depth of what she sacrificed, the love she carried silently for years. That knowledge matters more to me than the danger it cost to uncover it." Damien nodded slowly, something like relief passing across his features. "She would want you to be safe above all else," he said. "Moving forward, I intend to ensure that remains true. Regardless of how our relationship continues to develop, you will never again face danger like this alone, Julian. That much I can promise you with complete certainty." They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, and Julian found himself, despite everything, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him, standing in gardens far removed from anything he had ever known, beside a man who only days earlier had been nothing more than a feared name, whispered cautiously among neighbors. Now, that same man felt increasingly like family, bound together not by blood, but by shared loss and mutual devotion to the memory of one remarkable woman. "What will you tell people about Vincent?" Julian asked eventually, curiosity finally overcoming his hesitation to ask about matters clearly outside his usual understanding. "Surely others within your organization will notice his absence." "The official explanation will be retirement," Damien said carefully, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of departure that raises no immediate questions. "The full truth of his betrayal will remain known only to those who absolutely require it, protecting both the stability of my organization and, frankly, protecting you and Elena's memory from becoming public spectacle within a world that shows little mercy toward vulnerability." Julian appreciated the careful thought behind that decision, understanding intuitively that Damien's world, operated by rules and considerations, far different from the simple, straightforward life he had known selling bread each morning. Still, something in that explanation troubled him slightly, and he found himself asking the question before fully considering whether he wanted the answer. Will he simply be allowed to live quietly somewhere, after everything he did? Damien's expression grew more serious, weighing his response carefully. He will face consequences appropriate to the severity of his betrayal, consequences that will ensure he never again holds influence or opportunity to harm anyone connected to this family. Beyond that, I do not think the details would bring you comfort, Julian. only additional worry you do not need to carry. Trust that justice, as it exists within my world, will be served appropriately, and allow yourself instead to focus on healing from everything you have endured these past several days." Julian accepted this answer, understanding the boundaries of what Damien was willing to share, and recognizing that some aspects of this world would likely always remain partially obscured from him, regardless of how close their relationship eventually grew. It was enough, for now, to know that the immediate danger had passed, that Vincent's betrayal had been exposed and addressed, and that he could finally return to his ordinary life, without the constant fear that had shadowed him since gunfire first interrupted his morning routine. Over the following days, Julian divided his time between his small apartment and Damien's estate, slowly growing accustomed to the strange new rhythm his life had taken on. Margaret visited occasionally, bringing additional documents she had uncovered about Elena's years in hiding, small fragments of her hidden life that helped complete the picture both men were still piecing together. Callum, once settled safely in his new secure location, sent word through Damien's network expressing gratitude for their protection and offering, whenever Julian was ready, to share additional memories of the woman he had helped disappear so many years earlier. Julian found himself increasingly drawn to these small fragments of Elena's hidden history, each one adding depth and color to the mother he thought he had fully known, revealing a woman far more complex and courageous than he had ever imagined during his childhood. He began keeping a small journal, recording these newly discovered details alongside his own memories, determined to preserve her complete story for whatever future family he might someday have of his own. Damien, for his part, seemed to find similar comfort in these shared discoveries, visiting Julian's cart most mornings before his official duties began, sharing quiet conversation over fresh bread and rediscovered memories. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, neither man rushing toward a connection that still felt fragile and new, both of them understanding instinctively that trust, once broken so severely within Damien's own circle, needed to be built patiently and honestly between them. "I keep thinking about what she wrote," Julian admitted one morning, several weeks after Vincent's exposure, as he prepared his cart for the day's customers. "About loving me, being the only way she found to keep loving you safely. I used to think that letter was simply about grief. Now I wonder if she somehow hoped, someday, we might find each other." Damien considered this thoughtfully, watching Julian's practiced hands shape the morning's first loaves, with the same careful precision Elena had once used herself. "Perhaps she did hope for that," he said finally. "She always believed in connections lasting beyond immediate circumstances, in love finding its way forward even through impossible distance and danger. Maybe some part of her always knew that if I ever found you, I would recognize in you everything I loved about her, and choose to protect that connection, regardless of the risks involved." Julian smiled at that thought, warmth spreading through his chest despite the lingering weight of everything they had endured together. "She always did believe bread could fix almost anything," he said. "Perhaps she was right, in more ways than either of us initially understood." Julian returned to his cart, his customers relieved and curious about his sudden absence, though he offered only vague explanations about a family matter requiring his attention. He continued baking Elena's recipe each morning, the herb and honey bread that had first caught Damien's attention, though now he understood its significance far more deeply than he ever had before. Damien visited the cart often in the following months, sometimes simply to buy bread, other times to share quiet conversation about Elena, piecing together memories from both sides of her hidden life into something resembling a complete portrait of the woman they had each loved in their own way. Slowly, carefully, something resembling family began to form between them, built not on obligation, but on genuine affection and shared history neither had expected to find. Eventually, Julian agreed to expand his small operation, accepting Damien's help in opening a proper bakery in Elena's honor, a permanent space where her recipes could be shared with far more people than a single street cart had ever allowed. They named it simply after her, the small sign above the door reading Elena's, a quiet tribute to the woman whose courage and sacrifice had ultimately brought together two people from entirely different worlds, united by love for the same remarkable woman. On opening day, Julian stood behind the counter, flour dusting his hands just as it always had, watching Damien standing near the door, greeting customers with a warmth Julian suspected few people outside their small circle had ever witnessed from the feared leader. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the golden crust of fresh bread cooling on display, and Julian felt, for the first time since Elena's passing years earlier, that he was no longer navigating grief alone. Elena's recipe, once simply a means of earning a modest living on a quiet street corner, had become something far greater, a bridge connecting past and present, danger and safety, loss and unexpected family. Julian understood now that his mother's careful, quiet love had never truly ended with her passing, but had instead continued rippling outward, reaching across years and secrets, until it finally brought together everyone she had ever cared for, gathered now beneath a small sign bearing her name, honoring a legacy built from nothing more than flour, honey, and the enduring, unbreakable power of love passed forward, generation after generation, safe at last from the shadows that had once threatened to keep it hidden forever.